the builders in at our central London studio, so we're out west, here in the big glass box. It's pretty cool. But back in Westminster, for Rishi Sunak, the clock is ticking loudly. By this time next year, he has to call an election. He has a maximum of 368 days to persuade Britain that he should keep the keys to number 10. Handily, he's told us exactly how to judge his government. His priorities: inflation, growth, debt, waiting lists and immigration. Well, Prime Minister's a busy guy, and on this show, we always want to be helpful. So my colleagues have come up with this neat dashboard that when the PM tunes in on Sunday morning, he can instantly see how well he's doing on his 5 promises. We'll be checking it regularly, and I'm sure our panel of insiders will be dispensing wise advice to him as the weeks go by. That is what public service broadcasting is all about. More later. But let's get started with our guests. First up, a little earlier, I spoke to the Secretary of State for Defence, Grant Shapps. I began by asking his reaction to comments made by the UK's top counter-terrorism police officer that the election could see an escalation in the terror threat to the UK.
I leave the analysis of that to the counter-terrorism experts, but you're right. In my speech at Lancaster House on Monday last week, I warned about what I see as a more dangerous world in which you've got a number of different protagonists, and you mentioned some there, Iran, obviously Russia, North Korea, who might see it upon themselves to interfere in our processes. Obviously, that's something that we take very seriously. We have a number of different counter-terrorism and other institutions who'll be looking very carefully at that. And we must make sure, of course, that we maintain a very safe system for our democracy. I'm confident we'll do that, but I think the counter-terrorism chief was absolutely right to raise the alarm.
Well, of course, it's not just the stated enemies that might be a problem for us. The police are saying that what's really ticking up the terrorism risk is the situation in the Middle East. And you, of course, have expressed your anxieties about the increase in the number of anti-Semitic incidents here as a result of that. But does it help in any way that the Prime Minister of Israel, Mr. Netanyahu, is saying that Israel would not accept an independent Palestinian state on its borders? Does that help in any way to calm the situation and reduce the risk of consequent terrorism here?
No, and I think it's disappointing, actually, to hear that from the Israeli Prime Minister. There isn't another option. The whole world has agreed that a two-state solution is the best way forward. The British government absolutely backs that as a solution. It needs to be viable. It needs to be sovereign on the Palestinian side. It needs to provide security guarantees on the Israeli side. And there isn't another obvious way out of this. So I thought that was a disappointing comment. The United Kingdom certainly remains wedded to that. And by the way, you mentioned that I raised concerns about the number of anti-Semitic attacks that have been on the rise since Hamas's appalling terrorist atrocities on the 7th of October. I feel the same way about the rise in Islamophobic attacks as well. And, that's not the country that we are here in Britain, and there is no reason to allow events there to spill over here.
If I may return, stay with the issue of Israel, Mr. Netanyahu. One tempted to say with friends like these, I mean, who really needs the enemies? But the point I really want to ask you about is both you and the opposition have been pretty steadfast in your support for Israel, the country. But at what point does the Israeli government's actions increase the risk to people here in Britain and lead us to say that perhaps things may be better dealt with if there's a different leadership in Israel?
Well, as ever, we don't interfere in other countries' democratic processes, be that in Israel or anywhere else. And as you pointed out in your question, there's a fundamental difference between who happens to be in power in a country, and that country itself. And Britain has very close and friendly relations with Israel, as indeed we do with many other countries in the Middle East. I've just been in the last few days to the Middle East, for example, to Egypt, and we maintain relations everywhere. But yes, there is, there is a concern even within the Israeli system. You'll find quite a bit of disagreement because they're made up of a coalition government with people who have different views.
But
I think
Netanyahu's being pretty provocative, isn't he? Really.
Well, look, I've already said I don't think I can be more explicit. I think it's disappointing to hear Benjamin Netanyahu saying he doesn't believe in a two-state solution. In fairness, he's said that all of his political career, as far as I can tell. I don't think we get to a solution unless we have a two-state solution. So, we do disagree on that particular issue, but we do agree that Israel has a right to defend itself, and we do think that there is a responsibility to maintain international humanitarian law, and that's something that I was speaking to my opposite number, Minister Gallant, about as recently as Wednesday.
Okay. All right, let's returning to the speech that you made last week. You said rather strikingly that you thought we were in a pre-war period. How annoyed are you that the Chancellor this weekend, instead of committing to paying soldiers and particularly sailors better and providing you with more money for planes and boats, is talking about tax cuts? He's got his priorities wrong, hasn't he?
Well, first of all, the Chancellor has been incredibly generous. I think actually at nearly 10% pay rise for our brave armed forces. I don't think that anyone else in the public sector received a pay rise like that last year. There hasn't been a decision about this year yet. And in terms of the overall size and scale of our armed forces, we now spend over £50 billion a year, the most in cash terms. And I have for example, I was just looking at our equipment programme over the next decade. It's £288 billion. So yes, I argue for greater spending. Yeah. We are committed to spending more when conditions allow, but I also think that it is true to say that people do want to see more of the money that they earn kept after a very difficult period through COVID and this war in Ukraine. People deserve some of that money back, and actually this month they're receiving it with the biggest tax cut of £450 for somebody on the average salary coming into their pay packets the next week.
You've thrown out some rather impressive numbers there, but honestly, Secretary of State, you can't have it both ways. That 50 billion you talked about is what, 2.5% of GDP. Now, the former head of the army, Lord Dannett, pointed out that when he was in charge 12 years ago, he presided over an army of more than 100,000. You're projecting that in the next few years it'll be round about half that. The truth is, you're telling people the world is scary, but you're not providing the resources to protect us. And that 50 billion you refer to is around about 2.5% of GDP. Others think that that number, including Dannett, should be around about 3%. You're way short of what you should be spending.
So just for accuracy, let me correct a couple of things there. We're not at 2.5% yet. We're comfortably above 2%, and our pledge
I was being generous to you.
No, and I don't want to overtake credit on this, as it were. But we are pledged to, when conditions allow, get to 2.5%. That's right. The size of the army, as you said, in Lord Dannett's time, would have been over 100,000. It's not projected to go down to 50,000. It's actually specifically to 73,000 plus the reserves. The third thing to say
is... that's next year, but by 2027...
No. Our plan is 73,000, not lower. That is our plan. But
So just to be clear, you are saying that under the Conservative watch, the size of the army is not going to fall below 73,000.
That's correct. The plan is actually for 73,000 plus the reserves. But I often find, and I've noted it a lot since I did this job, when you start to talk about the armed forces, people often revert to talking about the army as opposed to the Air Force and the Navy, and of course the much wider structure, which includes things like cyber and space and many other defensive elements to it. The size of the overall armed forces is, I think, 189,000 right now. It's much bigger than when people just revert to only talking about the army, specifically, the land force. The second thing to say, well, I was going to say this is really important. The second thing to say is it isn't a question of how many men and women you have on the ground only. It's about how lethal your armed forces are.
I want to come to that.
Conflicts.
I would really like to come to that, but can I just stop you on the money? Because that's what's important here. Back in August 2022, and you weren't even Defence Secretary then, you said the defence of the realm is the first duty of Her Majesty's government. Can we afford to spend more money on this core responsibility? The answer is we can't afford not to. And you are talking about 3%. Now, you're telling me that 2.5%, that's a good result. A couple of years ago, you said we shouldn't be spending anything south of 3%. What's happened?
So nothing at all. I agree we need to spend more. In fact, my speech, which people can look up from Monday at Lancaster House, was all about how the world would need to spend more over time. If you gave me 3% tomorrow, I wouldn't be able to spend that in the very short term. Because
so we've got to rely on the Americans now?
No, I was going to say we already outspend 2/3 of NATO members who don't get above 2%. In fact, apart from the United States, I think we're the biggest spender in NATO by some distance. So we already do our part. My call was, and is, for the world to spend more. First of all, the rest of them need to get above that 2%. And in the long term, I do believe that the Western spending will need to be higher. I'm very happy that at the staging post, and this government's policy is to get to 2.5%. So there's nothing inconsistent about that at all.
That's interesting. You need to spend more. John Bolton, who I've interviewed, and that interview will be later in this programme, says that he thinks that the United States and the UK need to get up to 4, 5, 6%. Is that sensible?
Well, look, I'd say this. It's not only about the amount of money you're spending. It's also about how you're spending it and the technology you deploy. For example, today I've released information about a couple of things. One, Sea Viper updates. Now, those are the missiles which fire from HMS Diamond.
A million a time.
Yeah, they're expensive pieces of equipment, but we are funding an upgrade of them because, for example, we've seen how they've been helpful in the fight against the Houthi maritime threat. But it is also the case that lethal weapons include things like, you talk about a missile being a million times. I've also, just let me make this point, announced about a laser today that's in testing, which costs about a tenner to fire and would take down drones and missiles as well. So technology can make these things cheaper as well.
Forgive me for hurrying you along, but I know your time is limited. I just got to ask you about a couple of other things very quickly. The Americans, particularly the Pentagon, were pretty cheesed off with you last week because they said that in an interview, as it happened, with Sky News, you tipped the wink to the Houthis that they were going to get a rocket, literally, and that essentially you revealed something that shouldn't have been revealed ahead of time. Have you smoothed over relations with them?
Well, I can tell you that my relations with the US and the Pentagon have been extremely good, and we worked on very careful language.
Yeah, but they were hacked off with you, weren't they? They were annoyed with you.
I've seen that story reported in a weekend paper last weekend. As far as I'm concerned, it isn't true. We worked very carefully on our language. I was asked what would happen, and I said, there will be consequences if they don't stop, and watch the space, and that's exactly, of course, what we had agreed that we would do in order to signal very clearly that the Houthis needed to stop, and as you saw subsequently, they didn't, and we did have to.
Lastly, can I just quickly ask you, I mean, all of this is well and good, but in sport, what we would call the unforced error may be the thing that makes us lose. And we understand from our defence editor, Deborah Haynes, that in the Middle East, we have 3 mine hunters, and 2 of them collided in the last few days. One backed into the other, thinking it was going forward, but somebody wired up the engines in the wrong way, and the thing went into reverse. So now, instead of having 3 mine hunters, we've only got 1. It's pretty humiliating, isn't it?
Well, look, just as in aviation or many other walks of life, sometimes accidents and incidents happen. There's a full investigation.
But this was incompetence.
Well, look, you may know more than I know about it, in which case I've spoken to the First Sea Lord, who's in charge of the Navy. He has assured me that there is an investigation underway. And as with all of these things, we don't say it's incompetence when we see an aircraft come down, very rare occasion, just as would be a rare occasion. It's right to leave the investigators some time to work out exactly what's gone wrong. Something clearly did, and we need to see what it is. I'll tell you what, when I talk about competence, I went to see HMS Diamond and the incredible 220 crew on there, the first Royal Navy to have seen live fire. They are a pretty competent bunch.
Secretary of State, thank you very much for your time this morning.
You're welcome.